Hello there and welcome to this edition of People, Politics and Power. I am Imoni Amarire. Well, at the just ended 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, the United States of America, President Muhammadu Buhari of Nigeria raised an alarm over the recent trend of unconstitutional takeover of power in the West African sub-region. He was talking about military coups and attempts at overthrowing democratically elected governments in the various countries in the sub-region. Now, he warned that the democratic gains of the past decades in the sub-region are being eroded by these negative trends, while urging the international community not to tolerate the trend. President Buhari was, however, forthright enough to identify one of the drivers of this trend as the propensity by some leaders to unilaterally manipulate the constitutions of their countries to suit their political fancy. He therefore urged leaders to adhere to term limits prescribed by their constitutions and refrain from the temptation of staying beyond their mandates and their welcome.
In West Africa especially, our democratic gains of the past decades are now being eroded. The recent trend of unconstitutional takeover of power, sometimes in reaction to unilateral changes of constitution by some leaders, must not be tolerated by the international community. Nigeria fully supports the efforts of ECOWAS to address this growing challenge and appreciates the support of both the African Union and the United Nations. In this regard, I would like to reiterate that as leaders of our individual member states, we need to adhere to constitutional provisions of our countries, particularly on term limits. This is one area that generates crisis and political tension in our sub-region.
President Buhari there at the 76th session of the UN General Assembly. Now, to be sure, the re-emergence of military coups is a malaise that goes beyond the West African sub-region. In a space of 2 years, that is, between 2019 and 2021, there have been at least 8 military coups or coup attempts on the African continent. On April 10, 2019, Sudanese military forces ousted long-reigning President Omar al-Bashir from power after a prolonged civil rebellion which claimed the lives of scores of persons. This was followed by a failed coup attempt on June 22, 2019 in Ethiopia, which had ironically been mediating in the crisis in the Sudan. Now, a little over a year later, on August 18, 2020, the military struck in Mali, toppling President Boubacar Keïta and Prime Minister Bobo Cisse and taking power. 4 months later, on December 17, 2020, there was another coup attempt, this time in the Central African Republic, where former President Francois Bozize attempted a comeback. That attempt lasted for over 3 weeks before being put down finally on January 13, 2021. Now, in March 2021, there was an attempt to disrupt the democratic trajectory of Niger Republic just days before a presidential inauguration in that country. That was after a successful presidential election. And just the following month, in April, the military forcefully installed Mahamat Itno Deby as interim president to lead a transitional military council in Chad in what the opposition called a dynastic coup, following the killing of Muhammad Idno's father, President Idris Deby, by rebel forces. And then on May 24, 2021, there was yet another coup in Mali, in what was described as a coup within a coup, as the military leaders of the 2020 coup decided to replace some of their civilian collaborators. In the global community, that is, if the global community thought it has had enough of coups, along came the September 5 coup d'etat in Guinea, which overthrew President Alpha Condé, who had successfully gifted himself a third term in office after altering the constitution through a violent and dubious referendum. But even before that coup could sink in, there was an attempted takeover in Sudan by a group of soldiers said to be sympathetic to disgraced former President Omar al-Bashir. Sudan, of course, holds the inglorious record of the most coups on the continent, 15 coups in all, with 5 of them being successful and 10 have been unsuccessful. The question that arises is, why the upswing in the resort to military coups in the disruption of the democratic process? Clearly, over the last 2 decades or thereabout, democracy has been taking roots and growing strong on the continent, while military rule has become unfashionable, detested, and abhorrent by citizens and the international community. So, why the seeming return to the undemocratic practice that tends to isolate such military regimes? Is there such a thing as a good coup, no matter the circumstance? What are the chances of militarily governed countries returning to constitutional rule without the military constantly looking over the shoulders of civil authorities? How much danger does this trend pose to other democratic governments on the African continent today? How can the ghost of military interventions in governance be permanently laid to rest? And what message does the emerging trend send to democratic dictators on the continent? Because whether we like it or not, there are some democratic dictators on the continent. Join us in a moment. All right, thank you so much for staying with us. People, Politics and Power focuses today on governance on the African continent and the pressures that possibly democracy is being put to by the military. And I'm joined in the studio at this point in time by Mr. Chika Nwozuzu. Mr. Nwozuzu is Chairman, Governing Council, Nigeria Model United Nations Society, and a policy and development analyst. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Moni. Thank you.
We expect to join us very shortly also Moses Essien. Moses Essien is a former commissioner for education, youth, and sports in Akwa Ibom State. He's an international relations expert, policy analyst, and the DG of Diplomatic Business Group. He should be joining us in a moment. Mr. Nwozuzu, thank you so much.
Thanks
for joining us. Right. So, before the UN General Assembly that just ended, there had been a number of military incursions or attempted incursions into power in West Africa and on the African continent. And the President Muhammadu Buhari, I think, used the opportunity of the UN General Assembly to not only sound a note of warning, but draw the attention of the global community to these happenings. Did some of these attempts, or even successful ones, come to you as a surprise?
Well, thank you, Moni. When the Malian coup happened, I actually was I was surprised because sometimes we want to categorize what happened in Chad as a military coup, but much as they have actually classified it as a dynastic coup, one believed that it was a transition of power from father to son. Idris Deby was killed, and then they felt that in order to bring their assumed stability, they needed to have Mahatma, his son, to take over power. So it wasn't just like, it was an arrangement that they made, where the one that happened in Niger was something that they had wanted to scuttle the inauguration of the president. But then that of Mali, started in 2020. If you had seen it, where Ibrahim Boubacar Keita was the way it was removed. And then you had this 39-year-old Assimi Goïta assuming power. You see, you begin to look at the trend. Those days of young people, if you remember when the earlier coups of even the one of 1963 in West Africa, I think it was Togo that introduced that, when Etienne Yadema, popularly known as Yasimbe Yadema, with some group of soldiers, removed the Sylvanus Olympio. So it was always a group of young officers, and then they installed Nicolas Grudnik, whom he later removed as a president 4 or 5 years when Nyadema now assumed position. What am I trying to say? You have a group of young officers who initiated such activities. So the trend is really bad, Imoni, because if you look at it, when you are beginning to have military coups, succession, the one that succeeded in Mali, and after that Guinea, is a thing of worry to all of us. And then the most worrying part of it again was that if you look at what happened in Guinea, the people were happy about what happened. So what did that portend? In the past, Imoni, you and I know that certain things that drove military coups, number one, you either had the US and the Soviet then rivalry. You also had the issue of dissident groups who were supported by the France, because some of their colonies or so-called territories actually wanted independence. But these days, you are beginning to look at the line that these coupists, if I want to classify them that way, because when they are successful, they become heads of state. They are looking at mismanagement. The line is, we want to curb mismanagement, corruption, and then poverty. So it is not something that one begins to really appreciate. It is not something that one actually takes lightly. So to tell me, yes, I really was surprised with Mali, but again, I wasn't surprised with that of Guinea. And that's how it goes.
Well, if you say you are not surprised with that of Guinea, the situation in Guinea poses a major challenge. Not just to the sub-regional body ECOWAS, but possibly to the entire international community.
Yes.
Because there was Alpha Conde having extended his rule. He was elected, recall, in 2010,
Yes.
and was supposed to run 2 terms. And after 2 terms, he
decided
proceeded
in 2020,
amend the constitution,
Constitution, yes,
in a very, well, some have described it, dubious manner, and extended his rule for a 3rd term. And so, but all of that was happening in the full glare of the international community. Nobody at that point in time challenged his pranks or his attempts at manipulating the system.
Well, I think more or less, number one, you look at the issue of sovereignty. They will look at this as a sovereign state. And, it has happened, not just in Guinea. It happened in Uganda. Yoweri Museveni did that. It happened in even Cote d'Ivoire. Quite unfortunate, a country where the man had assumed when he got into power, Alassane Ouattara. And then it happened with Paul Kagame of Rwanda. So they felt that if it was, the way these leaders present this so-called referendum to change or extend their leadership, is that they believe that, first of all, you want to amend the constitution. After amending the constitution, you make everyone believe that it was the people's job. But then you know quite well that the way they amended the constitution, the way such referendum were actually held, or referenda in most cases, since there were more than one, were questionable. But again, everyone was looking at it, that, look, one of the things that Alpha Conde did was the way he brutally dealt with his people. And unfortunately, Guinea, in terms of development, I think most of our leaders, or most of African leaders, had forgotten what happened before they gained independence. If you look at Guinea, Guinea holds such a very prominent position. If you remember in 1958, when the French wanted to, they wanted to have this referendum on the Franco-African community, the constitution of this Union Française, it was only Guinea. The 12 territories voted yes. Ahmed Sékou Touré was actually the only one, because he was a unionist. He wasn't like, the intellectual Leopold Senghor of Senegal, or the bourgeois Félix Houphouët-Boigny of Côte d'Ivoire. But he was a unionist, so he stood, and then he made a statement, that's actually what I'm coming to. He said, that was one of the things he said to France. He said they prefer poverty in freedom to riches in slavery. That was the guiding principle of most Africans' independence those days. But the leaders have forgotten. Though Ahmed Sékou Touré's regime, you know how he ended, how he created the Camboy and all these other areas. So I think most of our leaders forget this thing. You have a term of office. The constitution is so clear. You have 2 terms, whichever way you have it, or 3 terms. The constitution wasn't made for you. If the one before you has stayed beyond his term of office, would you actually gain any position? So I think that's where the problem is. But it's a bottled up anger. Everyone will be, taking it. But when the opportunity actually came, or when it comes for the military, they strike.
All right, we're happy that Mr. Moses Essien has joined us now. Mr. Essien, former Commissioner for Education, Youth and Sports, Akwa Ibom State, an international relations expert, a policy analyst, and the Director General of Diplomatic Business Group. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Essien. Right, so
thank you.
My first question to you is, are you surprised at the latest trend, some kind of upswing in military pressures on democratic governments on the African continent?
Thank you very much. And first I want to say I'm very sorry for coming a bit late. I would say that I am, on the one hand, surprised, on the other, not exactly. What do I mean? I'm surprised to the extent that the military within the continent, from what has happened so far, the case of Mali, the case of the recent one in Sudan, and the threat in Sudan, and what we had in Guinea. These, if you look at them, there's a common thread that runs through all of them. And this is linked, this I can identify clearly as a case of ineptitude in leadership of the politicians, the civil class. And for example, maybe we should just zero in on the case of Mali. The case of Mali brings to fore the issue that leaders fully don't understand. They assume office, they don't fully understand the requirements, what is required, what is expected of them constitutionally. And if you saw what happened, what played out at the end of at the initial period, when the then vice president, who is now the interim president, took office, and the charges he leveled against the ousted president, you discover that it is a threat that has been very consistent within the continent. So, but on the other hand too, I am not surprised completely, because this you don't give instruments of state violence to people and then you turn a blind eye or you turn your back on them. So it still boils down to the issue of inability of leaders to understand the issues of state policy, the issues of statecraft, the management that is required. For example, like it is in Guinea, it is in Mali at the moment. But don't also forget that coups have this push-pull factor. And in the case of Mali, I see more of a push factor. External forces are mainly involved. If you look at, the decision that the French government took immediately after the coup, and the sudden turnaround to now begin to, flow with the incumbent administration, you discover that there is a push factor. There must have been a push factor that precipitated that coup. So, in what is going on within the continent at the moment is more of external influence on the instruments of state violence, which is the armed forces that we have.
Now, the thinking in most places and in most sectors across the continent, and in the last 2 decades especially, democracy or democratic structures had begun to take very firm root. We had gradually moved from the frequent military interventions into having democratically elected governments. But then all of a sudden, from 2019, we are now beginning to see this new trend of some young officers just waking up and accusing those that have been elected and put into positions and overthrowing them. The expectation is that, look, let those who have been elected make their mistakes and correct their mistakes. Do we need the military to help the civil populace get the politicians to correct their mistakes?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Why do I say that? There's no way the military can assist the political class correct their mistakes. Why do I say that? The military itself is a regimented institution. So they have no idea how to relate, with the lower rungs of the society. That's none of their business. That's not their calling. So intervention of the military, to a large extent, like I said earlier, has always come from a push-pull situation. I want to, in our own context, I personally want to commend the Nigerian Armed Forces. The Nigerian Armed Forces have shown so much maturity. They have shown so much responsibility and commitment to subordination to civil authority. So what is happening in these countries, Mali, Guinea, recently in Sudan, I feel it's more of a situation where the institutions of state, the political class, have either ignored this segment of the society that is very, very important and very, very vital. Like I said earlier, you don't put arms in the hands of certain categories of people. Politicians should not. It is irresponsible of the political class to put arms in the hands of certain categories of people that constitutionally are custodians of state violence, and then you turn your back on them. Now, why do I say that? The military is a service institution. And as a service institution, what is most required, apart from the arms and ammunition, is the well-being of the officers and men that constitute these services. So if you ignore their well-being, certainly, there will be something that could be very fundamental in terms of decision on their part. So, in essence, it is important for the political class to keep supporting, to keep promoting, to keep ensuring that the armed forces, not just in Nigeria, in the continent as a whole, is properly taken care of.
Chika, let's explore further the push factor that he has talked about. Because earlier on you talked about what I describe as a non-intervention policy of some of regional bodies and sub-regional bodies like the ECOWAS, the AU, the UN, and all of that. Even when they know that political leaders are doing the wrong thing in manipulating their own constitutions, they turn a blind eye to it, only for them to turn around like the ECOWAS and the AU is doing right now and telling the military boys who now take over to say, look, you must return your country to democratic rule. Now, they didn't tell the ousted president at that time that what he was doing was wrong, or did not pressure him to stop what he was doing. So, is there a link between the pull and push factor and his non-intervention policy of other states?
Well, if I understand the push factor from my brother, which I totally agree with him, he tried to look at what happened with the international community. You know, if you look at some of these things, ironically, the two or the three that we've actually had were actually coming from the Francophone countries. And of course, you know the grip that France had, and I think they still have on those countries. Along the line, they still have defense agreement. They still have economic agreement. In most cases, they determine the foreign policy of this country. You know, if I also take you back, I reminded you of what Ahmed Secretary said. When the French were leaving, you know, of course, history had it that they took almost everything there, even the idea of taking the bulbs and every other thing.
And destroying what they could not
Destroying
take.
even the medicines in the hospitals. They destroyed those things. We also, I don't know how true that, but we were told that a former French president was in Guinea a week or so, or two or so before the Guinean because there was a rivalry or there was a dispute between a Jewish French citizen, an entrepreneur in Guinea, with the government. But be that as it may, my problem with some of these regional bodies is that they are turning themselves to be toothless bulldog. And you can always have it, we encourage the coup plotters to hand over and make sure that democracy, and then they will send some of our leaders, including those that have served our country, Nigeria, to go there and mediate. The issue is this: the political class also must take majority of the blame, like you actually more or less brought to. Are we really practicing democracy the way it should be practiced? And again, have we also built the capacity of the military for them to know their responsibility? We're engaging the military. And my brother said he encouraged, I like that optimism of saying that that our military, but I can say it, that the road to Mali, the road to Guinea is not far from any country, including Nigeria, with what is happening. If you don't strengthen democracy, you're still bound, you're going to have some opposition. If you remember some years back, we were even told that some of our rich men were the ones who actually funded some of these military coups. So if you don't stabilize democracy, if you don't have a strong democracy, you open yourself to so many things. You and I know what is happening now at the National Assembly, where people are no longer seeing their representatives as being transparent and credible, by virtue of some of the decisions they have taken, by virtue of not making election credible. The most glaring case is the issue of electronic transmission of election results. I can't imagine in this 21st century, two people that I'm going to mention that actually had said things that anyone will imagine. You can imagine someone saying in his village, a former governor who's a senator, a former governor, and when he was the governor, he really was looking at industrialization of his area and could say that he never had network in his area. Meanwhile, we have seen him informal level formal level where he's been making calls. You also see another politician say one of his reasons why he doesn't support the electronic transmission of vote or election result was because the opposition are involved in hush puppy and those are comments that, let's not forget that the military men, the younger ones, also have their wives who go to the same market. They have their wives who also have involved in social media. They listen. So they take advantage of some of the grumblings of the citizenry. So when you ask of all these bodies that you're looking at, they don't seem to come in at the right time, Imoni. I think that's where the problem is.
All right, Mr. Essien, I'll come to you very shortly to feel your pulse on the role the international community can and should play in getting some of these countries to respect their own self-giving constitutions when we return from this break. Thank you so much for staying with us. Is the international community failing in its duties or just hiding behind certain international conventions to make sure that countries and political leaders especially respect the constitutions of their various countries? Mr. Essien, if the ECOWAS, the AU, the United Nations, and all such sub-regional and regional bodies keep quiet when they should speak up or when they should act, and then wait until the worst happens, and then begin to dish out directives and orders to people, to those who have taken over power, whom they know will not respond to them, as has happened in Mali so far, as we have seen in Guinea so far, I mean in recent times, and we have seen previous occasions and all of that. Is the international community not failing its duties as such?
Well, the international community, every state that is a member of the global body is sovereign, and to that extent there's a limit to what the international community can do. One of the steps that the international community can take could be possibly in the area of sanctions. Sanctions, we have seen, often more or less hurts the ordinary citizens. And travel ban could be one of those steps that the international community could take. But beyond that, there's a lot of hypocrisy. You have to come to that reality. There's a lot of hypocrisy in the international arena. Most nations of the world that have economic relations with countries that are involved, of course, will not be committed in decision-making that will affect the interests of the countries that are involved in a way and manner that it may adversely eat into their own interests within these countries. So you try to balance between diplomacy and possible actions that could hurt the nation that are involved. So international community may not really bite as much as they will back. They may back, but with little strength to bite. And if juntas are made to see that, of course, they will not naturally know, juntas are made to see that staying on in power is illegal and seizure of power is unconstitutional. So I would want to say that as long as condemnations have come and will continue to come against military rule in the continent, there is very little that the international community can do to stop it completely.
At the AU level, there is what they set up a few years back, the peer review mechanism. How has that worked? How has that helped in moderating the conduct of fellow heads of states and presidents. If at that level, presidents and heads of state cannot advise their fellow leaders not to toe this degenerate line of action, is the AU, for instance, or the ECOWAS, does it still hold any promise and any effectiveness for member states?
Well, let me start with the sub-regional body, the ECOWAS Commission. The ECOWAS Commission has, I would say, has achieved a lot within the limits of its available strength and resources in stabilizing the sub-region. But then in also looking at that, look at the role ECOWAS played even in the case of Mali, in the case of Guinea. So ECOWAS, to a large extent, is still very, very useful, at least within the sub-region. But then they have their limitations. These are sovereign states. The highest that ECOWAS could do outside intervention, direct intervention in these territories, probably could be sanctions. Sanctions on these nation states. But don't also forget that ECOWAS citizens are members of those territories. So there's a limit to what ECOWAS can do. Otherwise, it will further hurt the interests of its citizens within these countries. So with respect to the AU and the prayer review mechanism, you and I will agree that it is difficult, if not impossible, for heads of states and government. They can meet at various fora, conferences and all that, at AU summits, and look at what they have done, look at what they are supposed to do continentally in the interest of the continent, the citizens that make up the continent. But bear in mind that until the mindset of African leaders is worked on, the mindset of African leaders is altered, there's very little that can be achieved. However beautiful the prayer review mechanism layout is as it is, but you can see that there's very, very little that has been achieved in that direction.
All right, Chika. The president, in his speech at the UN, also identified a number of what he called causes of conflicts and crises in nation states, particularly on the African continent. And he talked about poor and undemocratic governance, human rights abuses, poverty, ignorance, injustice, and inequalities. These to us, many Nigerians, are very familiar terminologies. They are things that we live with on a day-to-day basis. But there are places where one or all of these things cannot be tolerated and can actually lead to some of the conflicts and crises, and in fact some of the military pressures on governance that we are seeing on the African continent.
Yes, Moni, it's a good thing that the president actually said some of these things. I really must also use this program to commend him. Since he assumed office, he hasn't missed any of the UN General Assembly sessions, which is very good. And then bringing up this issue is also very important. I really like where he talked about the issue of unconstitutional means of staying in power, and then again trying to change the constitutional term limits of leaders.
Does that give you some reassurance?
Well, he said it. He said it from except if his body language hasn't really made it. But I don't think what he said is like he's really reassured us that come 2023, that he's not going to say that. And one of the things those who actually are close to him know about that when he says something, he wants to keep that. But if you look at it, Imoni, why is it that after every military coup, you actually see the people rejoicing? Why is it that after every military coup, or any coup d'etat, you actually see individuals, is because the institutions, governance institutions, have not been strengthened, and they are lacking in one way or the other. I mentioned the issue of the parliament. There are also agencies of government that should actually take care of the citizenry. And if we continue to allow the military to always take this idea of corruption, take this idea of mismanagement of resources, take this idea of poverty, you will now remind yourself and say, okay, what happened in Gambia when Yahya Jammeh overthrew Dawda Jawara? One thought he was going to hand over. What happened to Yahya Jammeh? So these military guys who are also coming are coming out of greed. That's one area we have also, but they take advantage of the grumblings of the civil populace
and the failings of the political leaders.
The political leaders, because the political leaders have not helped issues. I also want to say that some of the things that political leaders actually say are not things that they should just say the way they say them. It's not really right. The way when we are saying all these things, don't just think that it's only the senior officers who are disciplined. You also have the indisciplined junior officers who are actually taking note and looking for the slightest opportunity. But another issue in money that I'm also worried about is the way we are also engaging the military. Because ordinarily, the way we are engaging the military, we are also bringing them, we're exposing them. Some of the things, that sometimes you want to quell election crisis in some of the states, you now want to bring in the military. The military person or the personnel will see how money is being shared. Okay? Now, he's taking note of all these things. He's feeling that, these guys have a way of actually playing with money. Someday, he will want to also bring the kingmaker. So we must also begin to, again, retrain our military so that they know their constitutional responsibility. I mean, in some areas, maybe I should also bring it to attention. In my state, Imo State, now there's I'm from Bitoli, from Morubi to Owerri, is a distance of about 10-15 minutes. For the past 5 years, you've had this military checkpoint. Now, a journey of 10-15 minutes now takes close to 2 hours. And I'm saying it on air. And my face should be taken note of. That these guys, I saw even the military guys even giving change to the motorist. What does that mean? If we don't strengthen our police, if we don't strengthen the police, we'll continue to look at the road to Mali and Guinea, not being too far. We must begin to, if we want to strengthen the institutions, our democratic institutions, we must also begin to strengthen the police. And we must keep the military back to their constitutional responsibility of protecting us in terms of when we have external aggression or when you have some level of insurrection. And this idea of trying to keep the military in governance or some of these activities, insurrection is more or less it's an ad hoc committee. You don't need to keep them there permanent. And then, and it's so annoying. Now the citizens do not even, respect them any longer. How would you respect somebody who gives change? When you say the driver say he doesn't have change, he said, don't worry, I have change. I have seen it. And I should be quoted.
Mr. Essien, so the question is, how do we put to rest permanently the ghost of military coups, military pressures on the political leadership or political structures in Africa, given these very debilitating factors that the President Muhammadu Buhari, talked about at the UN General Assembly of poor governance, undemocratic governance, human rights abuses, poverty, ignorance, injustice, inequality. These are things that are present with us in almost every African country in various degrees from day to day.
Well, the way to get out of it is between the political class and the military institution. First, the political class. If you observe, most often when there's military incursion, excuses that are given for these incursions are, like my brother said, corruption, mismanagement. They'll reel all these things out on the political class. So one best way to rein in military coup in Nigeria is true good governance. If we have governance that is accountable, that is responsible, that is focused on the well-being of the citizens, it will be difficult, if not impossible, for officers in uniform to launch an incursion into our democracy. So the first step is for the political class to be sensitive to the yearnings and aspirations of those they represent. First, from their constituents. Now, it is by means of good governance that the military themselves, good governance will also positively affect them. It will affect the military institution and their personnel, generally, because they are also citizens. So, the absence of good governance from the political class is also a major threat, will be a major threat. Now, that's on the one hand. On the other hand, within the military institution, what I feel is very important is training. And like I will come back to, I will always use my environment as a case study. Training, retraining, training and retraining of men, officers and men of the armed forces. Very important. And I'm very proud of Nigerian armed forces because virtually all the services have training commands. And if there's one thing I can give to the Nigerian armed forces, and nobody can take it away from them, is the training and retraining of personnel, officers and men of the armed forces. Now, that training is very, very, very important, and it will consistently, continually strengthen the military to subordinate themselves to civil authority. So, but I also remember, coup, of course, is punishable by death. And I think the authorities, the Nigerian government, the political class, should tinker beyond the criminalization and death of coup plotters. I remember, maybe I'll just say this. I remember when I was a research fellow in University of Ibadan, and in strategic studies, I did some work which I submitted to then CDI. That was 1992. That was late Major General Gumel. He was Chief of Defense Intelligence. And I think he took that to the then head of state. Coup is business. If it succeeds, the plotters, the wife becomes the first lady. Am I right or wrong?
You're right.
Good. The children become the first family. So if it fails, of course, both the plotter and those who would have been the first lady and the first family should pay the price. Now, if that was going to come, because I knew the then head of state was very serious. In fact, when one of my professors saw it, Professor ABC Mwolise, he screamed. He said, don't let them see this. But before he could say that, the thing had gone out. So it should be factored into the terms they will sign as they join the service. Not just that coup will be punishable by death on the plotters. No, it should go beyond the plotters.
All right. Chika, do you think that a time will come in Africa where there will be popular resistance to coups?
A time surely will come. One of the things that the social media has done is improving governance. Much as we're looking at it, it's quite easier. It's also improving governance. It's also helping helping some of these soldiers engage in unethical practices where you are the war front, you are recording, even when your commander had not authorized you. Oh, we're here, we're doing it. But Imoni, one of the things that will actually strengthen the system, and I totally agree with what my brother has said, the political class must remember what Abraham Lincoln said, 19th of November, 1863. when he went, you know, sometimes we want to quote this, but at the end of the day, the circumstances under which Abraham Lincoln made that statement was at the, you know, dedication of the Soldiers' Memorial Cemetery, where he said that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Now, you've seen what is happening in Germany in the parliamentary election. You can easily, Imoni, say, okay, now you have the Social Democratic Party is a bit leading about 26-27%. That was an election that took place yesterday. And then,
the results are already out.
Laschet, even of the CDU, is now looking at Olaf Scholz as probably the likely, it depends on the permutation. Now, for you to encourage the people is that an AMAC election will take place in Abuja. To get election result from Wuse will take 2 days. If you don't strengthen the institution, if you don't make democratic institution to be so clear, you're actually not going to have the people. They will say, they have seen you. You know, when you have this idea of see finish, it's a big problem.
All right, thank you so much, Chika. We must go now. Thank you so much, Chika Nwozuzu, Chairman, Governing Council, Nigeria Model United Nations Society, Policy and Development Analyst. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Mr. Moses Essien, former Commissioner for Education, Youth and Sports in Akwa Ibom State, International Relations Expert, a Policy Analyst, and is the Director General of the Diplomatic Business Group. Thank you for coming along.
Thank you.
And thank you for your time. Well, that's our program for today. Please join us again when we bring you a fresh edition of People, Politics, and Power. Bye.